Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Landscape Options, focusing on great underused plants. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series that was developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of each of our individual programs. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they are all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, and Eco-Landscape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Darryl Newman from Planters Choice Nursery. Welcome, Darryl.
Thanks, Penny. Thank you all for attending. Well, for those of you that are on the East Coast for a fairly late webinar, and for those on the West Coast, one that might have cut into your workday a little bit. So thank you very much. Again, my name is Darryl Newman with Planters Choice Nursery. Just a little bit about me, which will be followed by a little bit about Planters Choice Nursery, and then we'll get right into it. So I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Landscape Management from University of Maryland, which is a dual degree in Landscape Architecture and Horticulture. I spent 6 years in landscape design build in the greater DC area, 2 of which were in Maryland, the balance in Northern Virginia. I came back to work at Planters Choice, which is a family business, in 2004. I am a past president of the Connecticut Nursery and Landscape Association and the current legislative chair, as well as being member of the Connecticut Invasive Plant Council. Planters Choice Nursery was founded in 1970 by my father, Chuck, on family land. So I'm proud to say I am I'm a third generation farmer on my father's side and a 5th generation on my mother's side. And that's actually more of a title of pride than anything else I've ever had in my life. Planters Choice started as a propagation nursery on land that my grandparents had previously farmed. We're the most diverse wholesale grower in Connecticut. We have over 250 acres. We're working on almost 200 of it. We're the largest balled burlap grower in the state. And I say the most diverse because we have a full line of our own homegrown balled burlap, as mentioned, and container trees and shrubs, as well as perennial grasses and ferns. And we've taken a recent focus in the last 20 years or so on natives, and more recently, especially on ephemerals and ground covers that we think are viable plants and just really aren't necessarily available in the trade. A bunch of which bring me to why I am here speaking this evening. So getting right into it, I'm going to start with some trees. These trees, the majority of the trees we'll speak of are native, but not all. I think they're all viable plants that seem to me, as after being established, especially, seem to tolerate extremes in weather, which seems to be more and more commonplace every year. Getting right into it, Carpinus caroliniana has a bunch of common names for it. I most commonly refer to it as American hornbeam, but I've heard blue beech. It is an ironwood, and you would know if you tap the trunk. Musclewood also. It's got really solid wood on it, and actually a nice rippling effect on the trunk. It'll hedge fairly well. For those of you who might be into European-style gardens, I'm not going to tell you it hedges as well as European hornbeam, but it's pretty darn close. So you can pleach it, you can box it, you can do whatever you want to it. You can certainly make an awfully impenetrable hedge out of the plant. It's shade tolerant. It's actually a native understory tree in more wet conditions than one might expect. So as a result, I find that most native wetland plants actually tolerate poor oxygen by their nature. So that actually makes them fairly good for urban conditions where compaction is rampant, where there might be pavement all surrounding them. So what's the issue with compaction? Frankly, it floods. And these conditions often lend themselves to be either bone dry or sometimes soaking wet, either which is very difficult for a lot of the plants that we cultivate. It has extremely dense wood, like I mentioned. The one thing you want to do with it is you want to remove crossing branches. It does have a habit of kind of branching back on itself. So the one thing for aesthetic effect is you want to open it up. If you just work a little bit on it every year or two, it trims really well in the winter, as do most good hedging plants when you can actually see its form. That's about all you would have to do to this plant to maintain it. Has absolutely fantastic fall color. And my experience in creating an outdoor room with it is fantastic. I prefer to leave it limbed up 3 or 4 feet high and really surround an area, leaving it loose, trimming it tight. whatever one might please. Seems to have a really nice effect, and I love the concept of an outdoor room. Let's make a space that feels a little more private, especially if there's room for it in a slightly larger landscape with some scale to it. Next on the list, the native Sweetgum is an absolute winner in terms of its fall color. I don't think Slender Silhouette Sweetgum gets enough credit as being an exceptional columnar tree. Very low maintenance. You can see the two pictures. The one to the right is a recent picture. Unfortunately, I wish if this webinar was just a little bit later, you would be able to see the full fall color. It's just as nice as any Sweetgum. I've hardly seen any seeds on it, which might be a benefit for some applications. And I think the third bullet point I can't say enough. Do you really need evergreens for screening? I see people planting arborvitae, cedar, upright juniper of other sorts, arguably ad nauseum, and there's nothing wrong with those plants, but most of the time you're only screening for times when you'd be outside. So is it really truly necessary to have a screen that holds its leaves? Generally speaking, Fastigiate trees like this one branch heavily enough, it provides some screening, and realistically, if you're around an outdoor living space, people really aren't going to be outside when trees don't have leaves on them. It should also be mentioned, I said moisture tolerant. Actually, in our fields, it grows significantly faster in wetter, heavier soils. Because it can only be dug in the spring, the one catch is we do have to get them out of the ground. So our most saturated soils sometimes don't really work because mud doesn't work well for digging a good root ball. But again, a solid tree, virtually no pest issues with this one, and digs well, transplants well, and really performs well. Every once in a while, it'll send out a shoot that runs a little horizontal that'll then point upwards. Very easy to trim that right off if necessary. I have seen people top these. Once they get to a certain height, it seems to respond relatively well to that, as long as you don't just continually shear the top, but reach in and thin it out a little bit as well. It's definitely an effective way of using the plant. Next on the list is Oriental Spruce. There's some native spruces that are nice, but I don't know of a conifer, in my opinion, that's nicer than Picea orientalis. It's extremely shade tolerant. So for a spot that has a lot of root competition, that might be just have a little too much moisture for a hemlock, I'm not going to tell you it'll take soaking wet, but it will take some moisture. It turns almost a blackish purpley color in the shade, which is really nice, and it doesn't get incredibly wide. So some of the native spruce, white spruce in particular, has a habit of getting awfully wide, as does a Norway spruce. Those are probably along with the Colorado, which does stay narrower but really tolerates little to no shade. So of all the landscape spruces that are around, I think Picea orientalis merits more attention. It is slower growing, especially until it gets about maybe a 4-inch caliper, which would be an 8 to 10 foot tree or so. At that point, it speeds up some, but it's certainly not as fast as other ones. So because of that, it's generally a little pricier, but I think it's money well spent on this particular species. Next on the list is Aronia, arbutifolia, red chokeberry. This is actually one of the more common plants that I have on the list, but I don't think it's used enough as a landscape ornamental. Certainly right at home, it provides, I've observed how much the birds love the fruit, so it certainly provides food for wildlife, but I don't think people give it enough credit. It can actually be trimmed up as a tree if somebody really desired, but I think it's just a great landscape shrub with very clean foliage, excellent red fall color, that wonderful fruit set, and a nice white spring flower. Also, I kind of spent a lot of time by the shoreline after Hurricane Sandy to observe which plants are really salt tolerant, and I'm not going to put Aronia along the lines of, say, a bayberry, but it's pretty darn close. Maybe a block in, some Aronia survived, and it was under salt water off of Long Island Sound for probably several days, if I had to guess. Aronia will tolerate, it's native up and down a lot of the East Coast, so it makes sense that it's quite heat tolerant if it's given sufficient moisture. And it can tolerate average moisture. People tout it as a substitute for burning bush. I wouldn't go that far for survivability. It is not as drought tolerant. However, it certainly has as good a red fall color as pretty much any plant that comes to mind. So keeping that in mind, certainly a viable substitute if your clients are asking for that plant and you want a native, or more specifically a non-aggressive alternative. Next one on the list, You know, I could take a picture of the whole plant, but you just can't beat the flower on a buttonbush. It's a really neat flower. There have been a couple of new introductions to it that I'm not familiar enough with to tout, but I can tell you that UConn ran a trial with Buttonbush that actually did exceptionally well in a parking lot. So, like the last one says, native to wet location with standing water, it'll grow in a parking lot. Again, plants that can tolerate heavy soils, poorly oxygenated soils, generally speaking, can also tolerate drought better than we think. It's very fast, almost to a fault, but it's very easy to trim. I encourage people to reach in and trim out a stem of any of the large stemmy plants. I encourage that, and the reason is if you just cut the whole thing back, at one point or another, you're either cutting off the flower buds or you're cutting off where the fruit will set. So if you do have to do a massive cutback of a plant, I generally suggest it be done after flowering, because if it's done after the fruit set, you cut off the flower buds, which means you also won't have fruit for the next year. So the best of both, or the best solution to having to massively cut back a plant if you have to, is immediately after the flower. It does drop early, so that's something to consider. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. You get some nice early yellow fall color. It does mean that you might want to look at some plants that persist a little later. If you're in a wet spot, the Iteas of the world that seems to have fall color for an incredibly long time are a great option. You know, bottle brush buckeyes, another good yellow color if you are a little more upland. They blend pretty well together. They both kind of cover a lot of space in a hurry if you just need some area covered and budget might be tight. So again, it'll grow in standing water. That's what it's used to. I would mention, and I'll cover this again a little later, just because a plant is native to standing water, after it's been grown in any nursery, unless it's been grown being periodically flooded, which is really a niche market very few people touch on, it's now become accustomed to container culture. My rule of thumb is if you let a plant's roots find the water, you're far better off than planting it in the water and letting water find the plant roots. If you have to plant in standing water, I strongly suggest at a minimum you bare root the plant and let it shake off as much of the soilless mix as humanly possible. But again, I make no promises about results doing so. You're definitely better off at least planting it partially out of the ground so some of the roots can get the oxygen they need that they've become accustomed to, and let it root into that watery condition. And then you'll know pretty much the season that it finds the water, because all of a sudden you'll have very vigorous growth on a native wetland species. One of my favorites that we had a tough time getting into regular production, but we're on now. If anybody knows how to grow this one from seed, please let me know how within, excuse me, just bumped my mouse, within reason. Seems to me like it just takes too darn long to germinate, and it germinates really sporadically. Comptonia peregrina is sweet fern. Grows great from root cuttings. So you can take a shockingly small root cutting, stick it in a tray, put a little peat moss over the top of it, and leave it on mist for a period of time, and the results are exceptional. It's a great colonizing plant, as many of you probably know. As with many very drought tolerant plants, it also seems to go hand in hand with being very salt tolerant. Coastal Maine gardens up in, well, obviously Maine, have some growing in the shade, and I was shocked at how well it's growing there. Wouldn't have known that had I not seen it. I actually encourage you guys to, not in large numbers, but play around with some extremes with a lot of plants. You know, one or two here or there, see what they'll do. Some plants will shock you, even if a book tells you it's not going to do something. Don't always believe your books. And actually, I had a really rough situation when I was left with a 2-foot bed, I should say, that had a curtain drain underneath it that drained a bunch of water. Couldn't figure out what to plant there because it was always so hot and so dry. I actually did a hedge of sweet fern. It turned out that you could trim the daylights out of it. It was great for the maintenance crews because it had to be trimmed probably 3-4 times a year to keep it in. But because it was constantly trimmed, it always had that sweet smelling foliage on the customer's driveway. They were super happy with it, and I'm not sure what other plant I could have used that would have worked in that application with just a couple feet of soil. And it seems to me like it was coarse rooted enough, it never really interfered with the drain underneath it. The other thing I'll note is I haven't seen a lot of seedling variation, so I know a lot of folks who are ecologically sensitive do want some kind of variation and not a monoculture. I haven't seen much of anything with sweet fern. I don't think there'd ever be an introduction for that reason. It seems to be just a great native plant as it is. We do generally dig some root up ourselves from plantings we have around the nursery. We'll bring some in, and I haven't seen a crop that's noticeably different from wherever the source might be. Next on the list is a non-native. Everybody knocks on new introductions. They're not all bad. This is one from the Proven Winter series. I'm sure many of you have seen the bright white pots gracing nurseries around the country. This is called Yuki Cherry Blossom. It's a slender deutzia that, in my eyes, is a great improvement over Nico, which has been a spreading deutzia that's been around for some time. Generally speaking, when we're getting into ground covers, I don't mind a ground cover that's slightly higher if the aesthetics permit it, because frankly, you can let some low-growing weeds grow underneath it. So a lot of nuisance weeds that might have to be pulled, not invasives, but you could let crabgrass grow underneath the deutzia and you would never see it because this gets up probably a little over knee height. Like all other deutzia that I'm familiar with, it's very heat and drought tolerant. And on a slope, I would question if you'd ever really have to trim it. You certainly could. You could certainly go around. But I think one of the goals is if you have a nasty slope, you want to put something on there that after you maintain it to establish, you have to do as little to as humanly possible. This foots the bill. Nothing against the Deutzia gracilla species. That's a great plant. And there's a white introduction, which I believe is Yuki Snowflake, if memory serves. I just think that the pink is nice, and I think this is one of those plant it and forget it. I'm going to get into a number of ground covers coming up. I think that as an industry, if we can move, at least make an effort to move away from mulch and go for the green mulch that great champions have been pushing for some time now. I think it's a nice move in the right direction. On a personal level, I really just happen to dislike mulch. Next on the list is Dyervilla lanicera, northern bush honeysuckle. This is a picture at UConn. This was a trial block. The intent of this trial block was to leave it alone, and that plant pretty much looks perfect. So thanks to Dr. LaBelle for allowing me to use some pictures from her research. This is about 5 years ago. I believe it was in the ground for 3 years. So most people wouldn't consider a ground cover at waist height, but I challenge you creating layers as designers that maybe a 3 foot height isn't so bad if it's a uniform 3 foot. You could see the yellow flowers starting to come out. You have a pleasing reddish new growth that isn't so off-putting. Sometimes new growth can be a little too bright for certain applications. The red fall color is hard to beat, and I don't know of many ground cover shrubs for its ability to just take a beating. I love Grow Low sumac. That's not an underused plant. It's used a lot, and there's nothing wrong with that. This one would go head to head. I have started to see a borer that can get into the very weak wooded crotches of Grow Low. So I'm a little concerned about that, if it might spread. I haven't seen it so much that I'm screaming about it, but it's definitely around. And I haven't seen a pest that really bothers Dyervilla. And if you wanted to, you could trim the daylights out of it. I'm not sure what the application would be, but it certainly does warrant it. It just kind of keeps growing and spreading very nicely on its own. Moving away from natives for a minute, there are so many panicle hydrangea. I feel like I just had to mention one that I think is superior above the others. Sweet Summer hydrangea paniculata is a great plant that really doesn't need much care at all. Doesn't require fertilizer. I put in number 3s from our nursery in a really hot, brutal spot. Watered them a few times last year. I have not watered them this year. They just finally started showing the effects of what's been a really dry 3 months. They're wilting some now. It's part of my trial. I like to play around with plants at my own house to see how they really do. And I'll tell you that hydrangea paniculata in general are pretty tough. This one might make top of the list, and that is a flower show that just can't be beat. And one thing that should be noted about not just hydrangea paniculata, but this goes for a couple of natives as well, the arborescens and quercifolia, is you could time blooming within reason based on when you prune it. So if it's not pruned, it'll bloom the earliest. If you have an event, if you really want to work on it, generally speaking, when you stop pruning, probably 6 to 8 weeks later from prune when it's in growth, you'll see a flower. So you could, Sweet Summer will generally start to flower sometime in July. You could push that all the way back to September if you timed it right with how you went about trimming it. I wouldn't trim it more than twice, but it's certainly something that's worth considering if you to play around with, possibly to really nail the timing. Of course, it's dependent on how hot it is, fertility, water. There's a number of factors, but you can get it almost to a science. And considering this plant has a good flower show for 6 weeks, it's not as if you have to really nail the timing within a couple of days, unlike some other species. Viburnum praegans is a hybrid of 2 different viburnums, Retidophyllum being one of the more commonly known parent plants. I think this is the best evergreen viburnum for the Northeast. I put semi in parentheses because evergreen is relative on a lot of plants. Very few broadleafs are truly that evergreen. A lot of them just persist. Some leaves is very drought and very shade tolerant. It's very resistant to deer browsing, and very easy to trim. You know, I'm an advocate of hand pruning when possible, but I've seen these sheared into a fancy ball, and they seem to do quite well in that application if necessary. Most viburnums are highly adaptable, can be dug at most any time, which is nice in the nursery business. And also they can be installed at virtually any time. Some broadleafs you have to be careful going into winter about how well they're going to do. This doesn't really seem to be an issue, especially with Viburnum praegans. We've set some to the side and just completely ignored them. You know, plantings around the perimeter of the nursery, and they look fantastic all on their own. Getting into ground covers, some are going to be herbaceous, some are going to be woody. I'm not sure why Chrysogonum hasn't picked up yet. Green and gold. You can see this is one of our plants. This is a 1 gallon, and you don't see many flowers. If you waited a year, the amount of flowers that it has after it establishes is really impressive. So as I wrote, it's a native for a good chunk of the East Coast. Grows well in moist shade, and it has a really long bloom time after it establishes. And it's pretty much disease and pest free. We've been growing this thing and keep an eye on everything, but I'll tell you that a lot of plants that surround it, we have to watch a lot more carefully than this one. I think one of the issues is it doesn't jump out at you in the container. It really needs to root. It needs to send out some runners, and then it'll flower its head off. Seems like you get a 2-3 month flower out of it. And equally importantly, it's a great ground cover. It covers a lot of ground. It has good, clean foliage, like I mentioned, and can seriously smother some weeds once it gets going. It doesn't spread fast, but spreads very full when it does work towards spreading. Coreopsis grandiflora here. We only grow cultivars of it, but so I believe this is early sunrise here. But regardless, the plant itself warrants some merit. You see a lot of Coreopsis verticillata. They're not bad plants, but the threadleaf Coreopsis, it seems like in a lot of places, unless it's really happy, it's a 2 or 3 year perennial, and then it doesn't really stay. But this definitely has some staying power in terms of the daisy type flowers. This is one of the better native ones in my opinion. So it's a great option for dry and fertile soils. It can be readily dug up and separated, which invigorates any perennial. It's not unique to this one. It certainly helps if you wanted the seed, you could certainly let it go, but otherwise selectively deadheading this plant would allow for a second bloom. And we're having fits with Rudbeckia fulgida, in particular the cultivar Goldstrom, which is very popular. Downy mildew is becoming a major problem, and we do overhead water, which doesn't help, but it's a constant struggle to keep it clean. And I do see it in landscapes, even with drip irrigation or no supplemental irrigation at all. I see it moving in. So I would encourage people to take a look at some other options. Seems like species Rudbeckia fulgida does a little better than the cultivar Goldstrom. The cultivar Little Gold Star seems to be fairly clean, but that Goldstrom that people want hundreds and hundreds of is a really tough one for us compared to some other perennial options. Next on the list is Legula acuminata, hairy wood rush. I have nothing against Carex, let's be very clear, but it's not the only grass that'll work in a difficult wet condition. Legula is a winner as well. So growing in dry shade after it established is definitely an option. It's not gonna necessarily compete with, say, Carex pennsylvanica. That's an absolute winner there. It does prefer wet conditions. It holds a nice purplish color for the winter. It's very easy to maintain. So there are options. One can trim it back if they so desire. If it's left alone, it'll just create a nice little thatch, much like turf grass has a tendency to do, or especially if it's grown more like a meadow and mowed infrequently. But certainly can be left alone for long periods of time. Really important piece if we're picking out natives like this one that we're looking to have more of an ecological impact in a positive fashion. We certainly don't want to have to constantly go through and disrupt any sort of area that we're trying to get a better equilibrium on. So low maintenance is absolutely critical in those areas. Again, please don't stop specking carrots. Nothing wrong with it, but looking to promote luzula is definitely a great plant with a place for many common landscapes. This is a personal quest of mine. Some of you might have heard me talk about box huckleberry before. I think Geostacia in general is a great genus. I love black huckleberry. If anybody knows how to propagate it effectively in any numbers for wholesale growers, I am all ears. We're having a really hard time with it. Doesn't mean we stopped. It just means we're working on it. In our area, there's only a few known colonized spots still, some which are speculated to be hundreds of years old. So I look at it as one of those beautiful ornamentals that I'd hate to see go. This is a native plant that even non-native plant lovers can fall in love with, because it does have phenomenal red fall color, really nice glossy foliage, and can grow in some seriously dry shade once it's established. So everybody who I know loves the look of Arctostaphylos, but if you give it even a drop too much water, it can have a problem, and it doesn't grow in shade really whatsoever. It falls apart very quickly. So I would consider it a shade tolerant substitute for Arctostaphylos in that fashion. My experience is that the fruit on it is not viable for it doesn't reliably fruit, I should say, and perhaps it's because it's grown from cuttings, and maybe I don't know where a seed strain could, or where seeds could be found that are to encourage appropriate and necessary production, sexual production for that to happen. But in this case, they're edible, but they're not really abundant, unfortunately. So again, shade tolerant substitute for Arctostaphylos, great color all year round. I would really look to pair this one with something with a coarser texture. Going back to the plant itself, it's got a pretty refined look to it. You can see the nice red on one of them. There's definitely some variability in the plant itself in terms of when it turns color, but after establishment in a landscape, less so. I would look at pairing this with some grasses, maybe something with a coarser foliage. A nice dark leaf behind it would certainly show off the red fall color on the right, as well as the glossy foliage for the majority of the year on the left. I don't know about you guys. I'm a little tired of Vinca, so we're looking for substitutes. Michella does not spread nearly as fast as Vinca, but it is a very nice plant. It's slow, but it does fill in over time. It will smother weeds over time. If you wanna lightly trim it, even if you nip it back just a node, and by trimming, that means you can pinch it with your fingers as well as with the pruners if it hasn't colonized yet. Generally speaking, in the nursery, we'll pick the whole thing up because we don't worry. We're obviously not colonizing in the small containers we grow it in, and we'll give it a haircut. Encouraging that dense initial formation is a good way of making sure it spreads somewhat evenly. Definitely like some nice organic matter, and even moisture helps speed up the colonization. I think that it's an underused plant, maybe because it's slow spreading, but I think that even in large numbers, appropriately maintained for a reasonable period of time, good weed seed or relatively weed seed free compost will work wonders. It'll help this Michella colonize, and it'll help avoid weeds competing with it until it gets to where one might want. It's pretty darn evergreen, holds a nice color through the winter, and starts growing relatively early, as do many kind of native woodland species. Okay, this is about a 10-minute warning, so if you have any questions, I'd encourage you to type them in now so we can address them we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes to address any questions after I'm done speaking. This is Schizachyrum sculparium, little blue stem. This is specifically cultivar the blues in front of us, but whether you're growing cultivar or not, this is just a great plant. As long as you don't give it too much water, it really holds upright incredibly well. A lot of the dry prairie grasses can live for an awfully long time without needing to be divided. I think it's these native grasses have developed in these rough conditions. So when I say it's intolerant of excessive moisture, it'll actually tolerate some moisture, but it'll really lose its appeal of the really nice upright vase shape all on its own. It has a great red fall color. If it in a tough spot, it'll show earlier, but really persists. When I say a couple months, I mean it. It's got good red fall color for those couple of months, and it forms a really nice clump. Doesn't necessarily spread, but it'll definitely form a 12 to 15-inch clump in a few years from a small container. We're talking about a number 1 here, so a 6 to 7-inch round container. It can be trimmed like most ornamental grasses. I would suggest against it, other than first thing in the spring. It kind of tends to fiddle with its form a little bit, if you will. If it was getting tall, you could trim it, but I would just suggest looking at a different species that's a little more dwarf in the first place. It really is only 2 to 3 feet tall, has a beautiful seed head, doesn't seem to germinate readily, but definitely throws out a nice abundance of seed that's really attractive, and especially going into winter, seems to hold up to at least some harsh weather before it falls over. Another great grass is Spirabolus heterolepsis. I apologize to everyone listening. I didn't necessarily take the best pic. This is a picture of what we have here. It does not do a great grass justice. I definitely need a shot of this on a hillside because that's where it belongs. It has one of the largest native ranges out of pretty much any native plant. I don't know many that have a larger one. Goes way into the Midwest, way into Canada, and way down south. It's great for erosion control on dry sites. That's kind of a theme because we're often tasked with what to do with this forsaken area that people don't want to spend a lot of money on it and want to look beautiful. Spirabolus is really a nice option. It benefits from a trimming once a year. That trimming can be, I've seen people raise a deck mower as high as it goes and run it over, and it seems to come back just fine. I'm not advocating that as good horticulture, but I am saying that it can work. So again, nice to trim it once a year, but not necessary. It's called Prarie Dropseed because the seed just drops. It doesn't blow, but it doesn't really seed readily. Actually, it's a little tricky to grow from seed. A lot of people use divisions in production rather than seeds, so don't let that name fool you. It won't blow all over the place, and if it does come up, it drops right where it was, and you wouldn't even necessarily know it. It'll just widen the clump, if anything. I think American cranberries are really pretty ornamental, obviously used for cranberry production, but don't let those bogs fool you. Those bogs are very dry through the year. High organic matter, low pH, very acidic. The only reason why they're in a bog form, if you guys haven't seen cranberries being harvested, it really is a sight to see. It's quite remarkable. They're paddles that pretty much wrap the cranberries until the fruit lets go of the plant, and they're harvested in that fashion, but they do need a nice dry soil. So again, and the trick with these dry loving plants in general is watering them enough so they establish. And I am often asked, how often do I water this? That's a hard question to answer because I don't know what the site's like, but my rule of thumb is you water most any plant when you can stick your finger all the way in the ground. When we grow these in quart containers, I've never seen them grown in larger than a number 1, so meaning something that holds basically 1 gallon down to 3/4 of a gallon of water is about the specification for that. If you can stick your pointer finger all the way in the ground and it's bone dry the whole way down, you can look at watering. For those of us that don't use moisture probes or more technical means, the other trick is I'd recommend people carry a small crowbar with them. So you can dig about 8 inches into the ground. It's amazing what you can find. And the nice thing about a crowbar is if you dig up with a shovel, you make a mess. If you poke a little 1-inch round hole, you can peek right into it and see a lot of what's going on, rather than really making an unnecessary process out of inspecting material. Good, clean, glossy foliage, great red fall color, as we would expect from something in an ericaceous family. It has a nice little cup-shaped flower in the spring that is quite attractive. There's a lot of great natives with really nice, glossy, semi-evergreen foliage that I'm really excited are getting better known, and that I'm working well today on bringing to everyone's attention. And the last plant on the list is Waldistenia fragiroides. I've recently heard it called geum. I'll be honest, I don't always keep up with botanists on the newest names for plants. But Barren strawberry, Appalachian Barren strawberry in this case, is a really nice plant that, actually, let me go back to this. You wouldn't think it's evergreen looking at the leaf. It's pretty darn evergreen, doesn't drop a whole lot. I haven't noticed a deer bothering it. It's called Barren strawberry. It has a little brown, non-ornamental seed to it, so it's certainly not as glorious as a June strawberry would be, of course, but definitely a viable plant. Gets up a little taller, and this is a ground cover that when it establishes can compete with anything. So if there's invasive pressure, I think this is a good plant. And that's another point that I would definitely bring up is if eradication of anything, undesirable plants is part of the plan, putting something in is absolutely critical, because even if every last drop of vegetative matter is removed, there's no way all the seeds have been. So establishing a good ground cover is the best way to combat undesirable plants moving back into the landscape. Waldistenia is relatively easy to establish. I would encourage people. It roots so readily that take a look. It's one of those plants that can be easily popped down when purchased from a nursery. No big deal. Just tease the roots apart and make sure they're not girdling, because even relatively low growing plants like a ground cover can still suffer from a girdling root fairly easily. Definitely worth the time to pull the roots apart. And I generally encourage people, you don't really have to be incredibly gentle when you're pulling the roots. Nobody's saying get out a battle axe, but certainly just rip them apart with your hands. You can use a knife for pruners, whatever your preferred method is. Okay, so if I'm going to leave the screen up now, you have my email, you have my cell. I like talking horticulture. This is what I've done since I was literally 5 years old, sticking cuttings with my dad in the greenhouse. So any questions at all? I'm not going to say I have the experience of all of you in landscape design, but I did spend 6 years in design build. So if you have some questions relating to design and aesthetic and installation of plants, I'm happy to address them to the best of my ability. I've been in nursery production for the majority of the rest of my life. I'd be happy if there are any questions or comments, and if there's follow-up afterwards, please don't be shy. Take down my email address. That's my cell, and I'll be happy to address them to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Darryl. We do have a few questions from our listeners. The first is, what was the Buttonbush cultivar that you mentioned that was thriving in a parking lot?
It was not a cultivar. It's seedling Buttonbush that was found somewhere around the University of Connecticut. Excellent.
The next is about the Sweetgum. You mentioned it was a good screening option. Was that a cultivar?
Yes, Slender silhouette's the cultivar. So because it's so upright, I think maybe 5-6 foot wide at maturity for a really tight space for that narrow screen that everyone seems to be looking for. It's really a nice option. So I would task people to try that over a columnar Norway spruce or an emerald green arborvitae, or even a narrow or juniper. There's some really nice cedars that have come out. Taylor is a really nice upright. Juniperus virginiana for the people who prefer a native. But again, I encourage people to question if you really truly need an evergreen for that application, or for a really pretty deciduous tree. You're going to wind up paying about the same amount of money for a 10-foot tall tree, whether it's a 2 to 2.5 inch deciduous tree or it's an 8 to 10 foot evergreen. Your dollars are going to wind up being surprisingly the same. I'd encourage you to at least consider the deciduous tree route. There's some really nice trees. There's some really nice Fastigiate oaks that have come out. In addition to this, Fastigiate Carpinus. There's a native one. There's a native Carpinus caroliniana. I can't remember the name of it. I think it's Fire Spire comes to mind. that we're just trying out in our fields and seems to be a really nice upright. There's some really nice options in the deciduous world.
Very good. Is there a hedging plant that you would recommend for northern New England that's hardier than boxwood?
In terms of evergreens, that is a perennial question. That's really hard. If it needs to be an evergreen for a really cold climate, the hardiest one that I know of is actually there's a nursery. Strangely, I could tell you that this plant grows in the Berkshires in Mass, which is awfully cold. It's called River Queen, which Y Nursery introduced. That's the hardiest reliable broadleaf I know of. It's probably a zone 4 holly. It's got a leaf that somewhat resembles blue holly. Beyond that, I think you're in the deciduous world. There's some really nice hedging plants, ribes like currant. It makes for a really nice hedge and is incredibly hardy. There's some deciduous azaleas that can be hedged if so desired, but for a really tight formal hedge, there are also some Carpinus, the Carpinus betulus seedlings are relatively hardy, and the native Carpinus caroliniana for a slightly taller hedge. Although I suppose you could maintain it at waist height if you wanted to work at it.
Okay. You mentioned the Prague Viburnum. Are there any problems with the leaf beetles on that viburnum?
Great question. That's on more of the deciduous, less waxy plants in my experience. So it's a nightmare with a lot of the fragrant viburnums, as well as the native Viburnum dentatum is tough. I haven't seen really an issue with this one. Maybe it's a thick enough leaf and it's got enough of a cuticle that it doesn't bother it. I'm not going to promise you it's a non-issue, but I can tell you that I haven't seen it.
Okay. Does the range of the Spirabolus include the Northeast?
Yes, it's native. It's interesting. It's always a debate, and I don't really split hairs on this one. But I don't know how much native prairie there is to the Northeast, because at one point it was woodland as far as I understand it. So it's a really hard question to answer. But I can tell you that it is certainly colonized in the Northeast. So it depends on, are you talking pre-colonial or what? But it's certainly been established as a native for a couple centuries, I would speculate.
Okay. The last question that we have is, does Comptonia grow in urban conditions? And a follow-up, does it get leggy?
Yes and yes. Well, leggy is an interesting one. If it has room to spread, it doesn't, because it'll send out runners which stay full. So kind of like a great example, if you look at a maximum rhododendron that's planted on the forest edge, it'll grow out, and actually where you see the bases, where the foliage can sometimes be, I've seen it maybe 10, 15 feet away easily from there, and it appears to be full. So that's not necessarily really colonizing, but that's a leggy plant that might be full to the ground. But if you think about it, if you actually tried to stand that thing up, it would have 10 feet of wood showing. So as long as it has room to spread, it definitely won't be leggy. It also grows in incredibly infertile soil. It's a plant that you really don't want to fertilize. There's certain plants, and it's a lot of native plants, that you sometimes try too hard with. Our classic example is Viburnum acerifolium. I love maple leaf viburnum. You don't even bother to trim it, because it's the only plant that I think I've ever seen that if you trim, it doesn't create a break. If you trim it back, it just sends one shoot up. I don't know of a single, I'm sure there's other ones out there, but I don't know of another plant that literally trimming it does not make it full, or it just kind of distorts it and makes it look a little crooked. Again, most native plants thrive on neglect. Or let me say a lot of native plants. Let me backtrack a little bit there. There's a number of them that do thrive on. Basically, if it's a native plant and you observe where it natively grows, and you can do your best to recreate that condition, and that goes for any plant. Is you just do a little homework on where it's supposed to grow and try to replicate that to the best of your ability on installation, and I think that'll really dramatically increase success.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Darryl, for teaching us about some new plants and reminding us of others that we haven't used for a while. This has been very helpful. So thank you all for participating, and good day and good gardening to you all.
Good night.